So what are you holding there?
I'm holding 2 gems that came from the British Museum and which I'm now bringing back to them.
Is that stolen property that you're holding?
Yes.
This is Dr. Itai Razzall, and to clarify, he is not the thief. But the gems Itai's holding are at the heart of the story I'm about to tell you. Remember this?
It's emerged that the British Museum was warned more than 2 years ago that objects from its collection were being put up for sale.
More than 1,500 items were stolen, damaged, or are missing from this place. This is a story about one of Britain's most revered institutions and the theft of ancient treasures that were sold around the world.
It was very shocking. It was worrying.
I had no idea of the scale of that this would turn out to be.
The records they have of such items is so poor, even if there is any, they don't know what they've lost.
It's been a huge trauma for many people.
It's a story of warnings that were ignored.
My initial reaction was it's a cover-up. It's a dirty story, they don't want it out.
And of thefts inside the museum's own walls, targeting the very objects it was meant to protect.
I'm 100% certain we've got our man.
I remember that distinctly. My hair stood on end. I was absolutely shocked. Do you want me to talk or not talk? Or?
When Itai told me he'd caught a thief, it seemed too strange to be true. Almost. It starts with an unusual skill. Itai was born with a photographic memory.
I could actually look at a page of text, close it, and then I could call forth an image of the page in my mind and read the entire page. I used to do that as a party trick when I was young.
It's this skill that led Itai away from academia and into a rather niche profession, buying and selling tiny ancient Roman and Greek gemstones.
Well, I can make money out of it because very, very few people know about ancient gems. There's this very elementary thrill of the treasure hunts, but finding something that is actually far better than the sellers know about.
It's May 2020. Itai's at home in Denmark, looking through a book about gemstones in museums across the world. He's studying their features when he recognises one. It says it's from the British Museum, and it's a gem Itai knows well.
I could just about make out there were tiny little scratches, bits of incidental damage along the nasal ridge. It was clearly the same piece.
But he hasn't recognised it because he saw it at the British Museum. He's recognised it because a broken piece of it is going around the private market. The man who is selling the gem is Malcolm Hay.
Now clearly, if it was that gem, there's no way I could own it legally.
He's not the thief either, by the way.
And it belongs to the museum. The gem was even on their website. And my first concern was to try and contact somebody in the museum.
But how did the gem leave the museum? Malcolm's gem had passed through more than one pair of hands before him. But where had it first been sold? The answer is unsettling. It came from eBay, and a seller Itai had been buying dozens of gems from for years. Do you remember the first item you saw from Sultan 1966 on eBay?
That was in 2014. I got it for £15 plus postage, which I think was £8. So £23 something altogether.
And how much do you think it was worth?
In the proper London gallery or so, it could have been £4,000 to £5,000. It was obvious, very obviously, a Roman original. He told me they'd been inherited from a grandfather, which made sense.
And Itay is about to make a discovery about the identity of Sultan 1966.
He told me that his actual name was Paul Higgins.
But Itay had noticed another name on the seller's profile, so he questioned him and he gets a reply.
My name is Paul Higgins, but eBay have messed up my name several times.
Itay now feels suspicious of the seller's story. He decides to investigate further.
I began to look into my PayPal records, and there it was, the name Peter Higgs, which he had specifically, emphatically denied was his name.
Remember that name, Peter Higgs?
And it was my colleague who said to me, Itay, you do realize, don't you, that Peter Higgs is the name of a curator in the British Museum? And I remember that distinctly. My hair stood on end. I was absolutely shocked.
He'd done his Agatha Christie. He knew who it was.
Peter Higgs, a curator at the British Museum's Greece and Rome department.
Absolutely shocking, but believable.
And why is it believable?
Well, because it made sense. It's always someone on the inside.
The thief was apparently still operating within the museum walls, and it was an insider, someone with access to the stores. And that was a truly scary thought.
Itay decides to write to the very top of the British Museum. He tells them about his discovery. And of his suspicions that at least 3 gems he's seen for sale were stolen by their curator, Peter Higgs.
What I said was that all the evidence that I send you here suggests that this man, Peter Higgs, is stealing from the museum. Either it's he or someone impersonating him. I also wrote in that email that these items were sold for such measly amounts that this suggested to me that what I discovered was only the tip of a much larger iceberg.
He gets an acknowledgement email from the British Museum's Deputy Director, Jonathan Williams.
Thank you for your email and for bringing this information to our attention. The museum will now look into this matter.
And then Itay hears nothing for months. Now, remember this gem? The one with the scratches along its nasal ridge? While Itay is still waiting to hear back, Malcolm Hay returns it to the British Museum.
We had an appointment, they met me at the front entrance. They weren't really interested in where I got it. It wasn't a subject for discussion. Now, whether they already knew more or whatever, I don't know. They were just happy to have it back. I think embarrassed. They're clearly embarrassed. It was awkward for them. Perhaps embarrassed because they didn't want to ask too closely how they'd lost it.
Almost 2 months after Malcolm Hay returns his gem, Itay finally receives a fuller response from Jonathan Williams.
I can confirm that the museum has conducted a thorough investigation which found that the objects concerned are all accounted for.
But what about Peter Higgs? Well, Jonathan Williams also wrote there was
no suggestion of any wrongdoing on behalf of any member of museum staff.
But hang on, Malcolm Hay's gem had just been returned to the British Museum, so Itay knew what they were telling him wasn't the full story.
It was only handed back at my instigation, so that argument was totally beside the point. It had been sold, it had gone AWOL, gone missing. So, and I'd seen to it, with the help of Malcolm Hayes, that it had been returned to the British Museum. So to use that as an argument was bizarre, to say the least, totally absurd.
It seems whether Under the influence of the thief or not, the British Museum was trying to face it all down or deny that anything had gone wrong initially.
So, but I then asked Jonathan Williams if he could at least explain to me how it was possible that a documented British Museum piece had been offered for sale on eBay. He then replied to me,
it would not be appropriate for the museum to share the detail of its confidential internal investigations externally.
So he couldn't tell me anything.
My initial reaction was, there's a cover-up. They don't want this. It's a dirty story. They don't want it out. And I advised Itai not to pursue it. Forget it.
Well, I absolutely reject that. There was no, deliberate attempt to conceal from the public what had happened. The thief, as we now know, and we've revealed to the courts here, went to pretty elaborate lengths to cover their tracks.
The British Museum now believes that Peter Higgs had been altering records, including faking a note specifically about Malcolm Hayes' gem to try and hide the truth from his colleagues.
They come across a handwritten note that says, oh, this has been missing, this gem, since 1963. And they take that on trust. And again, it doesn't cross their mind that someone has written that in the last couple of years rather than back in 1963.
But throughout the museum's investigation, Peter Higgs, now acting head of his department, remains in his position. After months of trying to get answers, Itai's detective work begins to take its toll.
Well, there were stretches of time where I could barely think of anything else. So the only way I could actually deal with it was by letting it take over my life, letting it become an obsession.
So Itai seeks advice amongst his contacts in the antiquities world.
He said that he was very concerned that someone inside the British Museum had been stealing from the collection and selling objects on eBay. And he was also concerned because he tried to report this to the museum, and essentially he felt he'd been brushed off. The museum had said there wasn't a problem, but he was convinced there was. He said, perhaps they're dismissing me as a madman quite a few times. He was it was clearly chewing away at him, and he was in a, as I say, a dilemma about it. He didn't know what to do about it.
I was worried about him psychologically because he was clearly, it was weighing on his mind, and he was making himself ill with it. I was very worried.
So I was diagnosed with serious health issues, and a cancer, renal cancer, from which I'd suffered many years before, had now returned, and it seemed like, at the time, like I was a goner, frankly. I had to get this finished before I was on my deathbed, and if I died before the job was finished, I found that quite horrible.
Itai's suffering, but when it comes to the British Museum, there's a glimmer of hope. He eventually finds someone who will listen, a trustee at the institution, who puts him in touch with the museum's chairman, George Osborne.
He sends me on an email he's received from Dr. Gradell saying there have been thefts at the museum. I immediately asked the director of the museum, Hartwig Fischer, what's this all about? And he reassures me it's a historic allegation. We've looked into it properly before, and we don't believe it's true.
But a few months later, everything was about to change.
I remember so clearly getting the phone call. I was at home getting ready for Christmas. We were about to have a new baby in the family, and the director calls me and says, things have been stolen from the strong room. And that's when I immediately said, well, hold on, that must be linked to that email that I saw a couple of months ago. The director at the time was a bit skeptical that they were connected, but I was absolutely sure it was too coincidental. And I said we should call the police that day.
More than 2 years after Itai first contacted the museum, Peter Higgs is dismissed. The police are still investigating. But why did the British Museum take so long to realise something was wrong?
The British Museum has a great collection of ancient objects from Sicily, but they're mostly on a small scale. They're coins, jewellery, terracottas, pottery.
Peter Higgs was a prominent curator in the museum world. He'd worked for the British Museum since 1993.
It was very shocking, you know, it was worrying. The name that has been mentioned is obviously of someone who was in a position of trust, and so that identification, if it's right, adds to the shock, definitely.
From what I had heard, he was a rather quiet, introverted individual, kept himself to himself, you know, didn't have some lavish lifestyle. There were no clues, from what I'm told, amongst his colleagues, that, you know, he was all the while stealing things.
So trusted was Peter Higgs that a few years back he helped the UK government identify and return a stolen 2,000-year-old statue to Libya.
It sounded as though he was one of the great and the good. You know, he was called the Monuments Man. He was tracking down stolen goods.
He even appeared on the BBC's Crime Watch programme to speak about it.
You know, we're committed to trying to stop the illegal trade in antiquities.
Well, Peter, it's some brilliant detective work.
The British Museum believes items were being stolen from its collection over many years.
We're sure that the thefts had been happening for at least a decade, but we think it may well be more than 20 years. He prized the gold off some objects and the gold's gone, but the gem remains. Some of them will be permanently destroyed because the gold will be melted down, and who knows where that now is. I'm 100% certain we've got our man. We know who's stole these items. Missing items for the British Museum, missing coins were found in his house.
Peter Higgs denies he stole anything. And as for those ancient coins, he says they didn't come from the British Museum. In January 2023, the museum appoints a new keeper of the Greece and Rome department, someone who has never worked for the British Museum before. Enter Professor
Tom Harrison. I'm the keeper of the Department of Greece and Rome at the British Museum. Got a kind of dark intimations that something was going to be wrong that I would have to deal with, but no more than that. Found out in about the sort of second or third week the scale of the damage.
I guess it's an interesting way to begin a job.
Yes, it is.
Within weeks of starting, Tom is given the unenviable task of leading the recovery of the missing items and making sure all the objects in his department are accounted for. But there's a catch, and it's a serious one. The vast majority of those missing items had never been formally catalogued by the museum.
There are 107,000 items in the Greek and Roman department collection, and we're effectively going through every one of those to make sure we've got a completely solid basis for saying that they're with us.
So, can the museum ever be sure of what was actually lost? And how do they prove who did it?
I think the only way of hoping to recover them is to get the thief to disclose how he sold them and where he sold them. But we're a long way from that, it seems. And of course also for the museum to disclose what they've lost.
There are layers of data that we can use to establish what came into the collection and what we could have lost. We're looking at the registers that we have from the 19th century. We're looking at old archive material, which includes receipts, lists that were made before the items came here.
I think the problem is there. They don't know, and the records or the catalogue they have of such items is so it's poor, even if there is any, they don't know what they've lost.
What has this experience been like for you, dealing with the discovery and then the process of recovery?
that the people who work here do it because they care about the collection. And so something like this, the fact that items have been damaged on our watch, if you like, is something that goes to the heart of people's identity. And people here talk about the objects in the collection as if they were people. So it is felt very, very personally. There's no question about that.
Denmark, the home of Itai and his gem collection. That's what I've come here to see. Remember, over the years, Itai believes he bought hundreds of gems from Peter Higgs.
It's straight ahead here.
Having never considered the possibility they could come from the British Museum.
I can see a lot of white dots. What does that mean?
The white dots is my way of marking out the ones that come from the British Museum.
So that's most of them then.
And how many gems here do you think belong to the British Museum?
I think it's about 150 here and roughly the same amount in my drawer over there.
Itai's now in the process of returning all those gems that he thinks belong to the museum.
I feel I'm righting a wrong and I'm doing something constructive, and I enjoy helping the museum with retrieving the objects.
But here's the thing. Itai didn't keep all of the gems he bought for himself.
The items I sold on, I actually sold them on to people I already knew, fellow dealers, colleagues, friends, and a collector I knew very well already.
He's now on a mission to return those gems to the British Museum as well. Itai has travelled to cities across Europe on his hunt to recover them, including here, Paris, where he asked me to join him for the handover.
Hi, lovely to meet you.
Happy to meet you.
No one really wants to be mixed up in this story, including the collector. He asked us not to show his face.
As a collector, you laugh and you live with the pieces as well, and yeah, it's a very, very sad story for me. So I'm definitely not happy about it, but I'm happy it's going back to the museum. This is a much more important situation as my emotions about that.
Some of the gems Itai sold on have been on quite a journey. He says one even ended up in Hong Kong. And 2 others ended up back in a museum, just not the right museum. Those gems took pride of place in a small exhibition in a remote part of Germany. One is even on the first page of their catalogue. It's pretty hard to miss it. Not that that museum could ever have imagined they might be displaying stolen items. But what about the other gems sold by Sultan 1966 that Itai didn't buy?
I was not the only buyer, because the eBay seller, certainly Sultan 1966, he had other listings, so a substantial number has gone to other buyers than me.
In fact, we've seen court documents submitted by the British Museum which claim at least 45 different buyers bought from Peter Higgs. But who could they be?
I hope, sincerely hope, that other people who have, in all innocence, come by such gems will do the same and simply hand them back.
We've discovered that a large number of gems ended up in Washington, D.C., around 260, and a handful of others ended up in New Orleans. The FBI is now involved, and we've managed to get our hands on an email sent by an agent to a buyer in the US.
I'm a special agent at the FBI. We are assisting the London Metropolitan Police Service Economic Crimes Unit with their investigation of missing or stolen items from the collection of the British Museum.
Hundreds of the artefacts the British Museum says were stolen have been returned so far. And much of it is down to the work of one man, Itai Razzall.
It has removed all my former joy of buying and selling. objects, ancient gems, because I'm left with this as a constant fear this might happen to me again, that I could run into and inadvertently buy stolen goods. So it has robbed me of my previous innocence as a dealer, and I hope I will eventually overcome it.
But he is comforted by the thought that he has made a difference. And some of the gems that Itai once owned are now on display at the British Museum.
Yes, this is what I will be remembered for. It will be my epitaph.
I do think that his steadfastness and his refusal to just go away would have been much easier for him just to shut up and not worry about it, but he did keep worrying about it.
You know, I think Itai Razzall did the museum a great service. I'm sorry he was not listened to in February 2021 when he alerted us to these thefts, but I hope he can look at the changes that have been made and see that some good has come out of what has been a very sad and unfortunate series of events.
So, how does the British Museum even begin to recover from this? And all at a time when there is increasing pressure for it to repatriate contested objects in its collection, including the Parthenon sculptures.
I mean, I think it has been a very damaging story for the museum. I think it's tarnished its reputation as, you know, a safe custodian of World Heritage. So I think it's got a job to do to recover from that. I don't think it's broken, but I think it's tarnished.
Well, I'm always nervous of saying something can never happen again, and unfortunately human beings, you know, are capable of doing bad things. The museum today, a couple of years on as a result of this saga, I think is much more open, much more transparent.
But we may never truly know the extent of what has disappeared from its collections.
We're not only talking about items that are fully missing, but also items that are partially stolen. So I think in some of those cases, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see the material back. And the likeliest interpretation is that it was sold for scrap, unfortunately.
As for Itai, life for him is now moving on.
Things are much more cheerful now. As I said, for whatever reason, the growth of the cancer has sort of stopped. Back then, at the time, it looked pretty disastrous, and I was very conscious that I had to sort of get this wrapped up before I died.
You thought you were dying, and you were having to deal with this. You were having to concentrate on the British Museum.
Yeah, but I mean, you can't spend your entire day concentrating on dying, can you?
The end is near in terms of your gem hunt.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
How does that feel?
Great, lovely. Yeah, it's like sort of a closure for me.